Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit about the solar eclipse that's coming up on August 21st. But first I want to start off by playing a short clip from this video over here. This is Pastor Mark Biltz, and he's talking about the solar eclipse, and I want to go over some of the things that he says in this video, but I just want to start by playing this short clip first.
So my question to all of you is, what time is it? Do we know what time it is right now? Well, let me give you a good example. This is from Haggai, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. And it was in the second year of King Darius, and listen to this. It was in the 6th month, the first day of the month. You know when that is? The first day of the law. The same day Moses went up to the mountain, the same day Yeshua went to the wilderness, the same day Jonah told everyone to repent. The month of the law, it's on the month of repentance. This is the time when the eclipse comes across America, guys. Now look at this. It was in the 6th month, the first day of the month, the first of the law, that the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, who was the son of Jehozadak the high priest. And listen to what the Lord said on the first of Elul. He said this: these people, and he's referring to his own people, these people say the time hasn't come. The time has not arrived for the Lord's house to be built. And then the word of the Lord by Haggai came saying, look, is it time for you to dwell in your own panel houses while this house lies waste? What is this telling us? On the first of Elul is when God speaks to his people saying, you don't know what time it is.
Okay, so as you can see, he had just finished quoting Haggai 1:4. He was reading Haggai 1 verses 1 through 4, but he ended with Haggai 1:4, and this looks like the number 14. And what I want to show you is that there's a pattern with the number 14 that seems to be connected with the eclipse. I just noticed that while watching this video, but I also noticed the pattern with some of these tables that I've done, and I'll show you some of these tables later. But first I want to explain why the number 14 is important. Of course, it's in Zechariah 14 that the Mount of Olives splits, and this is a representation of the Mount of Olives. This is actually Mount Horeb, but Mount Sinai is also referred to as Mount Horeb. They all represent the mountain of God. Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, the Mount of Olives, Mount Zion. All of these represent the mountain of God. And what's going to take place with the Mount of Olives represents what's going to take place with the mountain of God. It's actually the restoration of the temple. It's going to be literal, what will take place, but it's also spiritual. And I want to try to explain that later. But the point that I want to make right now is that the number 14 seems to be important. It was on the 14th of Nisan that Jesus died on the cross, and that's when the veil of the temple was rent in twain. This was the precipice of what would later take place when this all comes into fulfillment. And what's going to take place with the Mount of Olives is actually a representation of what took place on the cross and the fulfillment of it when Jesus comes back and steps foot on the Mount of Olives. So that's why it's recorded in Zechariah 14. That's why it was in Exodus 14 when Moses parted the Red Sea, because that was also a type and shadow of what was going to take place. This all has to do with DNA. The word Red Sea in the Hebrew actually means sea of reeds, and I've talked about why the reeds represent the DNA in previous videos. And it's also in Revelation 14 when Jesus is standing on Mount Zion with the 144,000. And so all of these scriptures are connected with the number 14. And what I want to show you is that this eclipse seems to be connected with the number 14. So I'm going to play a little bit more of this video, and then I want to get into some of the tables and show you some more connections with the number 14. One more thing that I want to mention about the number 14 is that it would be 7 plus 7. So when the Mount of Olives splits, you would have 7 on each side, and this is a representation of the restored temple. 7 is a number of perfection, so you would have 7 on each side. So that would be another reason why this is all related to the number 14.
And this is what they're taught in Judaism from even 2,000 years ago. I have books from 2,000 years ago on what they taught. And they said because the Gentiles go by the sun for their calendar, a solar eclipse represents judgment coming upon a nation. A lunar eclipse, because Israel goes by the moon, refers to judgment coming upon Israel. Okay, or to repent. You know, they need to repent. And so this, one thing, I'll go ahead and mention it now. Yeah, many people don't realize this, but World War I started in August of 1914, and there was a total solar eclipse over Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And what happens? You have this total solar eclipse, beginning of World War I, and the Ottoman Empire is destroyed. It even went over Nineveh, the same place as where Jonah was. Now, obviously, the solar eclipse, they didn't receive judgment because they repented. It didn't happen for a while. So just like I never set dates for anything, but what I do say is look at the events that happen on God's calendar so you know if it's God who's speaking or not. And then hopefully we repent and judgment is staying. But I believe judgment, because it's falling at Elul 1 over, and this is the first time a solar eclipse has ever gone over the entire United States and nowhere else in over 100 years. The last one was World War I, and guess what? It was World War I, and it was on August 21st, the same as this one.
Okay, so he's saying over here the last time there was a total solar eclipse over the U.S. that was exactly like the one we have now was actually 100 years ago, and it was on August 21st in 1914. So you see he's mentioned the number 14. He mentioned Haggai 1:4, and then in this next scripture, this is connected with the number 14 as well, and I'll show you how in just a minute, but first I'll just go ahead and just play that little part.
First Chronicles 12:32, where it talks about the children of Issachar who had an understanding of the times. They were on God's calendar. They knew what Israel ought to do. So my question to all of you is, what time is it?
Okay, so as you can see over here, he said that the children of Issachar knew what time it is. This is in 1 Chronicles 12:32. And this, of course, reminded me of a scripture that I mentioned recently. And that's this one over here. It was actually in a music video that I did, so I didn't literally mention it, but it was in the video. But what I was trying to show in the video is how there's a pattern in the scriptures, and I can show you more examples of that between verses 10 going through verse 17, where there's a division that takes place in verse 14, and this is one of those examples. And the word Issachar over here, of course, this is representing Christ, because it's Christ who was on the cross when the veil of the temple was rent in twain. This is what was needed in order to restore the temple, to restore the DNA. But Issachar means there is recompense. And then I showed in that video that the two burdens is actually two sheepfolds. You can see that here. Okay, that's the Jews and the Gentiles. And you can see that here in Ephesians 2:14. So again, you have the number 14, where it says, He himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. And that's because it has to rent or cleave before it can cleave. And this is all a representation of the DNA being rent, and then the evil half being restored so that both halves are equal. And Jesus explained about the two sheepfolds over here in John 10, starting with verse 11, when Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. But he that is a hireling and not a shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth because he is a hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known of mine. This is in verse 14. As the Father knoweth me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. That would be the Gentiles at this point, because Jesus first came for the Jews, and then after the Great Commission is when the gospel went to the Gentiles. But before that, it was just for the Jews, up until Jesus made the new covenant, which is for both the Jews and the Gentiles. It's not just for the Gentiles. The new covenant is for everyone. And so then he said, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Okay, so this is the Jews and the Gentiles coming together and becoming one. And then verse 17 goes on to say, therefore doth the Father love me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Okay, so the purpose of all of this is to bring the two folds together, the Jews and the Gentiles, which are a representation of the sheep and the goats, the wheat and the tares. All of that is a representation of what has happened with the DNA. It's the seed of the serpent mixed with the seed of the woman. And it needs to be rent, and then it needs to cleave once again with Christ's DNA in order to be restored. And so that's why all of this is represented by the number 14. Okay, so now I want to show you a couple of tables, and then I'll explain how they're connected with the number 14 probably in the next video. But in this one, you can see I put in sickle, Leo, reap, lion, yesh, sun, moon. And came up in John 14. So you have Leo, lion, reap, yesh, sun, and moon. Of course, sickle makes sense to be in that scripture, but all those came up as well. And so I was curious what would happen if I would put in just the word sickle. And you can see that came up with 14 matches, came up in Leviticus 16. And it's talking about fire from the altar and the incense, which is a reference to Yom Kippur, and it's the same thing that Revelation 14 is talking about as well. Then I tried putting in the word scythe, which is another word for sickle, and it came up with 8 matches. And when I put in just the word August, it comes up in Genesis 50, 11 through 16. But this is all about the threshing floor and the wheat harvest being reaped. And of course, that's what Revelation 14 is about as well. And I've mentioned this before in videos that I did around this time last year, but this part of the constellation Leo is shaped like a sickle. It's the part that makes up Leo's head, as you can see over here. And then there's also the sickle in the constellation Boötes, but I'm about out of time, so I'll have to continue in the next video. Thank you.